It's the big Modi budget everyone has their eyes on, reviving growth, creating jobs, controlling prices and turning India into a favourable investment destination. It's clearly a tough task ahead, but can the forthcoming budget be a game changer? And will Arun Jaitley be able to live up to those high expectations? Hello and welcome to Budget Adda. I'm Shweta Rajpal Kohli and we're coming to you today from the headquarters of Industry Chamber CII. And with us here, captains of industry to take us through what they feel would be an ideal, growth-oriented, please-all budget that Arun Jaitley can present for the country. Let me kickstart the discussion by trying to understand some of the key priorities for the new government. What is it that the new government needs to focus on? What is it that the budget needs to focus on? Mr. Ajay Sriram, President CII, let me start by asking you, clearly reviving growth is one thing that the government has to focus on almost singularly. Do you think the budget has room to address that?
I think absolutely. I think the budget does have room. And I think if we see what has happened in the last 30 days, the government has been actually taking actions and moving ahead progressively in a moderated, thought-out way to give a direction of what is coming next. The budget document is one of the most important documents in the economy on an annual basis. My feeling is that the Finance Minister will come out with a good game plan, with a forward-looking game plan to actually articulate how we can come back to 8-9% growth in the next 2-3 years.
Right.
As you rightly said, I think for the economy, what we need is accelerating growth, creating employment. So I think that is the objective, and I think governance, infrastructure, manufacturing. I would say these three areas would be the focus areas by which we can come back to a solid economic footing.
Infrastructure, manufacturing and governance, those according to the president of CII should be the key focus areas. But are we expecting Arun Jaitley to do a bit much? After all, they've just had 30 days in governance. And what can a budget really do? Are we setting ourselves up for a bit of disappointment, Mr. Banerjee, if we don't see the kind of big bang announcements we're expecting this budget to actually make?
You know, it's not a question of today the expectations are indeed very, very high. And of course, there are limited means, so we'll have to really look at the budget under that microscope. But yes, of course, what we really need to see is the direction that the budget gives in terms of the thinking at this point in time of the government. And this is going to be the first sort of a policy announcement of the new government. So there is an expectation of that kind. So trends are important.
So you're saying the overall intent is what matters, Absolutely. Even though we don't see in terms of hardcore decisions, policy changes that come about in the budget?
Well, this is 1 year where you can take a number of hard calls, and which are very, very essential. And there are enough indications that the government is all set for taking some hard calls, which are important to take the economy in the right direction. So there are expectations of hard calls, and of course, it has to be spread over a period of time.
All right, so will it be almost disappointing if we see this government not taking those hard calls? And that's the critical question that we're hoping to ask right now. Does the government have the muscle to take some of those tough decisions? Mr. Munjal, we've been talking about trimming subsidies, ensuring that we are actually moving on the path of fiscal consolidation. Do you think this government will set that intent and make it very clear in this budget, especially subsidies? We've been talking about that for a very long time.
I expect this budget will not just be a statement of accounts of the government. This will also be a statement of intent of the government. So we are reasonably confident we will hear some serious long-term policy issues getting announced in this budget, also telling the country and the world what the government's long-term plan is.
Right.
So it would be extremely disappointing if we don't hear things like cutback on subsidies. And I would completely agree with you. I think we will hear these kind of announcements, but I think they will actually go beyond this and surprise us with some new announcements of how overall brand India can be built. If you look at the different components which go into building brand India, I think there will be a focus on some of the big issues here.
All right, how to build brand India, that would be critical. While cutting subsidies is something you always hear industry people talk about, economists saying, yes, that's the right thing to do. But that necessarily doesn't go down very well with the Aam Aadmi, who's obviously expecting some subs. They've brought this government to power. What is it that the government can do for the Aam Aadmi? Some way of saying thank you for voting for us.
You got to look at it in a holistic view. Purely by the results, the elections, we haven't seen some victory like this in a long time.
Right.
And if this, this is the time to take advantage of it. I'm not saying that the Aam Aadmi should be ignored. There has to be a balance where one day we get away from this subsidies. I'm not saying remove the subsidies this day one, but there has to be a road plan where the subsidies are going to be removed. And of course, we have to keep the common people in mind. They cannot be ignored. They are the majority and the backbone of the country.
Okay, I'm seeing some hands being raised.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are recommending to scrap subsidies, by the way.
Okay.
Just saying, please redirect them better, focus them better where they're required, stop the leakage, stop the wastage, direct them much better. I think that's the expectation, to use those funding for other areas like building infrastructure, improving governance systems. But where it's necessary, of course it should be there. But
All right,
only
so continue subsidies, target them better, and that's something that the industry spokesperson here is saying. Mr. Bassi.
I think it's a myth that the Aam Aadmi only wants subsidies. The previous government tried it and they got thrown out for it.
Right.
So I don't think we should be that shy about talking about we must give subsidies. Of course, the poor people have to be helped. But I think the Aam Aadmi is a smart individual. They see that subsidies is a way of greasing many pockets before the money gets to them.
Sure.
It often doesn't get to the right person. And therefore, I think if they focus on development, which is the plank on which they came here, it will benefit them the most in this budget. And I just hope they seize the moment, This is a honeymoon period for them, whether we like it or not. It is.
Right.
It is a majority government of a kind that India hasn't seen in 20 years. I really hope they seize the moment to express intent. Intent on, fighting tax evaders, fighting tax terrorism, corruption, building infrastructure, changing the way we educate, changing the way we skill people. That's really the need of the hour. I think this debate on subsidy is frankly, an old debate which should have ended about 10 years ago. We need some subsidies. The rest, we need development. And that's what the Aam Aadmi voted for.
All right, development is something that we're looking for, and Mr. Pramod Bhasin there making a point that that's the plank on which this government has been voted. But coming back to what the Aam Aadmi is really looking for from this budget, the typical reaction you get around a budget is, why is it important for me? What's in it for me? Can it actually help control prices? What most people perhaps don't understand is that a large part of controlling prices is the domain of the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India. But does a government have room in a budget to come up with policies that can actually help control prices? Inflation, a big worry, and a lot of expectations building up that this government will do a lot more than the previous government in terms of controlling prices. Dr. Virmani, your sense on whether the budget has any room to tackle the very basic issue of sticky inflation?
See, the basic, on the macro side, the inflation driver, there's a lot of evidence now that fiscal deficits over a long time are one of the important drivers of inflation. Right. Traditionally people don't think like that. They always think of individual prices. If I raise the price of diesel, there will be inflation. Technically, that is actually not inflation. It's a one-time price increase.
Right.
What derives inflation, which is prices going up again and again and again, is this fundamental fiscal deficit.
Right.
So that's very important to understand, which means that the most important thing in this budget, which the finance minister has to do, is to change the composition of expenditures from, as we just said, subsidies and what we call consumption to investment, which means the revenue deficit must go down. And that will create room for giving some of these growth and investment driving public investments, which are complementary to private investment.
All right, very important point there, but what's going to happen to some of those social sector schemes that really became the hallmark of the UPA government? Do we see tinkering of those schemes? Do we see them being better targeted? Do we need to continue with some of those social sector schemes? Who better than Dr. Naresh Trehan to talk all about it? We know that healthcare, education should be key priority areas. How should the government address these issues?
Well, if you look at, if you look at healthcare per se, there is such a huge gap that unless we get onto the business right away, it is going to be a huge sort of drag on society, because an unhealthy society, is a drag. So there are two fundamentals here. One is that the government spending on healthcare has been dismal. So I hope that in this budget, at least the indicators are there that over the next plan, that we will have incremental funding to reach 3% over the next 2-3 years. because this government spends the least amount of money in the world on healthcare. Second is the fact that there is already a huge infrastructure on the ground which is going waste, which is not being optimally utilized. So I think one of the priorities we should do is to figure out, and there are many ways of doing it, like public-private partnership, making efficiencies, and like somebody said, stopping leakages, that if we just spend enough to make that infrastructure operational, we'll see a huge change in our ability to deliver healthcare to 1.2 billion people. The third
But you want expenditure on healthcare to be increased.
Absolutely. And one thing we also must understand that, like somebody said, that India has changed from a petitioner society to an aspirational society. And that's the signals the last government missed and actually paid for it.
Right.
So you're saying the side benefit of healthcare is it's an intense employment. 9 million jobs can be created in the next 5 years in healthcare if we actually take it to the next step. And each one of them becomes a taxpayer on day one. So it's not a subsidy, it's not an expenditure which is wasteful.
Right.
It is actually a net tax gainer. Only healthcare has to be encouraged.
Okay.
I worry a little about this increasing expenditure because there is a huge amount of wastage in the system. For example, when we talk about rural health, the attendance of nurses and doctors in rural health is about 60%. So you can keep spending money, you're only going to get 40% results. So we have to focus on that. And one of the things which Dr. Trehan is very familiar with is e-medicine. Something you have to reach those people. You have to get the medicine there, otherwise it's a waste of money.
And the larger point really being that if you go on increasing expenditure, where are the revenues coming from? Quick word from Mr. Sriram before I go.
I just want to mention one point of what was mentioned just now by Arvind and Naresh. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I would tend to agree. I think what's required and coming back to is governance.
Right.
I think ultimately, for a country like India, with 1.25 billion people, with such a spread out country, state, center, districts, etc., I think some sort of rules of the game must be implemented with a little sense of fear that if I don't deliver, I can be reprimanded. I think today it's a free for all.
And a lot of that accountability is already in place, and we are seeing that Babu's being told, you know what, you have to come to work on time. There is absolutely no room to actually ensure that governance is not happening. Mr. Chatterjee, a quick word from you on increasing expenditure, but where are the revenues going to come from? It's all very well for us to sit here in a room and say increase expenditure, but where will the government get its revenues? How will we rein in that fiscal deficit that Dr. Virmani was talking about if we go on increasing expenditure and the economy is in the state that it's in?
See, look, so far as the infrastructure sector is concerned, historically the budget has been able to cater to only 15 to 20% of the annual yearly plan requirements. So we have to understand the limitations of the budget. This year I am not expecting more than anywhere between 15 to 18% being allocated for infrastructure in the totality of the budget, which means that with the huge infrastructure agenda that Mr. Modi and his colleagues have announced, to fulfill that in practical terms, he's got to do a lot of stuff off budget. But the budget then sets the tone for creating the ambient conditions and the structures for raising these finances in off-budget vehicles like Mr. Gadkari has done in the 1 lakh crore road fund. That's an off-budget vehicle. Okay. So in this budget, we are looking for a bunch of creative ideas that enable finance to be raised and projects to be implemented outside the parameters of the budget.
Any suggestions on improving revenues, Mr. Samani?
I think we should, one, curb corruption, invasion of tax. And the other thing is if you can expand the tax base. I mean, why should we not look at farmers who have a certain income which is there to have a fixed tax on them? So you've got to expand the tax base in the first place to get that revenue.
Okay, expanding the tax base, and every time we talk about some of these suggestions, what about taxing the super rich? And what better platform than this to actually get a sense on whether taxing the super rich is the right thing to go forward? I can see a lot of happy faces here. Is it a suggestion that you would want the finance minister to actually go ahead with?
You know, at the end of the day, many countries have imposed on the super rich. And I think it is likely to happen here. But the only way you should do that is, you know, one of the most shameful statistics of our country is 42,000 people declare an income of 1 crore and above.
Absolutely.
That is a scam by the educated, the elite, and the rich. Things like that have to stop.
Right.
And there are enough revenues, there's enough money flowing through the system to, host one of the great elections. Find some of that, tax it, use it. The government also has tons of assets, PSU assets, disinvestment, roads, land, lots of things in a systematic manner. As Vinayak said, it could do it. Super rich taxes, I don't think taxing the super rich has ever yielded too many dividends. But I suspect that this government will think about it, and so will many others, and it may happen.
It may happen. So that's a statement coming from many industry leaders. Taxing the super rich, clearly an idea that the government may be toying with at this point. But what about stable taxation policies? That's something clearly that the government needs to move forward and do. We know the kind of problems retrospective taxation has led to in the past. And perhaps one clear message this government needs to give to investors, both domestic and foreign, is, you know what, we're going to give you a stable tax environment. How critical is that for the government?
Absolutely critical. I think the tax terrorism, as you call it, has ruined the investment climate. Investment is not happening, and the tax guy gets more money from more investment. It is like killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. So the guys who are there, you squeeze them. I think retrospective amendment should go completely. And in fact, they should exempt capital gains tax altogether. If UK and US don't tax foreign investors, why should India? As it is, we've got Mauritius, Singapore, etc., for people to come in. So I think we should improve the investment climate, and that itself will increase the tax base for the government.
And a lot of that is part of building brand India, because after all, India's image was severely dented when we saw some of these measures being put in place. And when we talk about sectors like hospitality, tourism, it's all part of building that big brand India and telling people, you know what, the ease of doing business in India is going to improve.
So tourism actually is the biggest brand advocate actually from all sectors. And it's actually easy to operate. Means just look at the fact that India today gets 6.8 million tourists. Means look at what's happening in Thailand, the kind of problems, and they have a issue every year, but still they get 22 million. China gets 57, Turkey gets 36. Look at our coastline, look at the kind of monuments we have. I think it's an instant ticket. They just need to get the visa on arrival policy, which they've been talking about for 2 years, and they're still saying it's going to come in December. The moment that gets institutionalized, and I think the biggest thing in that would be how easy it is. Right. You can say that there's a visa on arrival, but I think the biggest challenge in India is execution. The biggest challenge in India is the final mile. And if we are able to do that, trust me, that will be so much employment generation, because tourism itself, because being a service industry, is a big employment generator. And more than that, it will be foreign exchange actually coming into the country. And
all right, and tourism is clearly a priority area for this government. They have made it clear that they intend to focus on it. But let's come back to the basic issue. We've talked about prices. What about creating jobs? We've said creating jobs is absolutely important. It's something that impacts everybody. Mr. Khattar, we've already seen the government going ahead as far as the auto sector is concerned and saying the excise duty cuts are going to continue. Is there more they need to do to ensure that the investment cycle continues, that we are able to ensure sectors like auto don't suffer the way they have in the last few years?
Can I come to auto a little later?
Sure.
Because, we are talking about the budget. I was hoping that the importance of budget would go down.
Okay.
And in the previous years, there was a trend that budget is just accounting and nothing else. And even today, according to me, major decisions are administrative and executive decisions. They don't have to come through the budget. You have a look at it. They've increased the fares of railways without the budget.
Right.
Many people have not realized the importance of delicensing that has taken place in the defense sector.
Right.
And it is going to create huge jobs in manufacturing. They've increased the price of petrol and diesel without the budget.
Right.
So the point I'm really making is, let us not have too much expectations from budget.
Temper down your expectations.
And the government should also do the same. And decisions have to be taken on a daily basis according to the need. It can't be once a year.
Okay, I'll just get a quick, I'll come to the auto sector, but a quick rain check from everybody. Should the budget be less important or more important? Perhaps some hands here at this table. Should it be less or more important?
Budget shouldn't be an important, like somebody mentioned about an annual account statement of the government could be there.
Does it need to be more than just a statement of accounts?
Intent should be there, certainly.
Right.
Especially the budget which is going to be presented for the first time by the new government. There's a lot of expectation related to, is there a deviation or a movement away from what the previous government is doing? So there's an expectation.
Well, there certainly has to be a vision at some point in time, and very often the government uses the budget day to create that vision, and there has to be an intent. So for the next 5 years, if there's an intent, then maybe the budget day is the right day to make that.
Okay, intent, and we were talking about jobs. I'm going to come back to healthcare, real estate, absolutely critical people there. Quick point from Mr. Majumdar here.
You know, this thing about the budget exercise, what we need to look at budget which is good for 5 years. It's not going to change every year. How does a businessman plan if things are going to change every year?
Right.
So we should look at a budget which is long term and then come down to a statement of accounts.
Okay, so the vision and a long-term vision is absolutely critical. A quick view from you, creating jobs. Dr. Trayan talked about it. Healthcare is a critical sector where creating jobs is important. What's the one thing he can really do to ensure we're doing that?
I mean, beyond healthcare, let me just talk. First of all, let me answer your question on budget. I do think this is a 2 or 3 speed world. There are some things that need to be done right away to fix sentiment, to fix what's not been done in the past. And there are lots of development and investment vehicles that need to be done. But let me talk a little bit about another hidden gem or something that's not been tapped as a sector, which is insurance. So Dr. Trayan talked about healthcare, which is great. Insurance is a huge sector where we have seen declines, actually. This is the least protected society in the world, which doesn't really have a social sector, sort of social protection by way of, social security. So you have a huge need to penetrate insurance. That per se has 2 benefits. One is it covers your population. Second thing, it creates huge amount of long-term funding, because where's the money going to come from for infrastructure and development? Right. And third is that it has huge potential for job creation, which we've seen in the past. So I think there is a massive agenda out here. And if there's one thing that I would ask for, is please pass the insurance bill, which has been lying there for 6 years. Absolutely. Please change the FDI norms for insurance so that it can feed capital. This is a very capital-intensive industry. So we want some support on that. And let us grow and fund the infrastructure needs of this country.
Okay, quick word from you on creating jobs.
Creating jobs, of course, the construction industry is big. Insurance, I agree. There is also retail. That's not been given enough, and there's a controversial thing, but retail can really create a lot of jobs. So construction, retail, housing is a major area, of course.
All right, it's clearly a very, very long wish list out there, and we can go on and on, but we've talked about key priorities areas. But in the second part of this show, we're going to try and understand what are some of those critical elements that captains of industry here want Arun Jaitley to announce in his budget. What are some of the things they definitely want to hear on the 10th of July? What are some of the things they clearly don't want to hear? That's coming up in the second part of this show.